Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to our second second episode of The Drill Down with Ahmed and James. I'm Ahmed, and that's James.
And I'm James.
Uh, so we've got a really interesting session planned for us today. James is going to talk to us about the DAR principle. And hopefully my slide deck will not fail on me. Okay, so this is a little bit of an overview of what to expect from the session today. As it was last time, we will have about 45 minutes-ish of content prepared, and then we'll allow for the last 15 minutes for our direct query segment, where we open it up for Q&A. So if you have any questions or any thoughts, ideally leave it till then. This time around, we are using Teams just for some logistical reasons that we'll talk about a little bit later. But if you have a question, it would just help us if you prefixed it with a Q, and we will gather all of those questions for the end, and we'll address them at that point, just so we don't interrupt the flow. So agenda items today, we're going to talk about the DAR principle. Was new to me, so I hope it gets new to a lot of people here, and we'll dive into that. We'll talk a little bit about how the DAR principle applies to Power BI development, because many of us are Power BI enthusiasts. And then we'll talk about some related concepts, because you may be familiar with some of these elements, maybe just a different name. And then we'll talk about some valuable resources as well. So we'll walk you through and hopefully send you off down the rabbit hole for that late night scrolling into Power BI blogland. I will pass it over to James because he's our expert here on this concept today. And yeah, drive.
Yeah, so thanks, Ahmed. Just if anyone wants to use the React capability there, show of hands, anybody heard of the DAR principle before for today? Okay, we got one.
Okay, cool.
Two. All right, cool. All right, so that's more than I was expecting. This is a very as far as the Power BI world is concerned, a kind of an obscure concept. Although, at least in this form anyway, there's probably people who have heard of a lot of the things we're going to be talking about today in terms of the underlying concepts. But in this particular presentation, or the way that it's being presented as dashboard analysis and reporting, that is, I usually don't see that a lot in the Power BI world. So, yes, DAR stands for dashboarding, analysis, and reporting, and the idea is that every page of a report or every section of a report ought to contain a different level of granularity. And I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said report. The pages or sections of a BI solution should contain a different level of granularity and should be designed possibly even with different audiences in mind, or people with different end goals in mind. So the dashboard page should contain high-level information. This is basically executive-level stuff, elevator pitch, the stuff that's like, hey, just check on it, go in there, take a look. Is anything on fire? Okay, no? Good, I'm going to go do other stuff. Oh, something's on fire? Find out more about what's on fire. That's kind of the dashboard level of things. The analysis page is more for visualizing the data in complex ways of looking at the relationships between different things, and the of course, you're looking for things like correlations between things, the part to whole relationships, things like that. But of course, we're still talking about looking at this at a higher level overview kind of thing. Whereas then once we get, so that's the report. That is the analysis pages. When you get to what is called reporting pages in this context, that's where you start seeing things like tables, where people who are familiar with the older school methodologies of reporting, things like SSRS or Power BI paginated reports, where the idea is just dump all the data on a table and let the users look at the individual values there. So of course, every one of those things has its every one of those types of views has its own reasons for being and its own strengths and weaknesses. And so harnessing all of those things and kind of putting them in their own place in a BI solution allows us to better present the information to the users in a way that allows them to understand it in the context that they are trying to use it. So someone who is an executive really doesn't need to look at the line item information in a report. They may not even need to look at the analysis level stuff. Most of the time, people who are executives are basically just the ones who are giving marching orders. And for the most part, they just want to look and make sure if something's on fire, they know what it is, and they need to know who to contact about it to go address that. And if nothing's on fire, they can say, okay, great. I'm going to focus on other strategic goals I have right now. But then, of course, you have people who are, in other positions in the organization where they're going to be more looking at the analysis of things and trying to say, what can we do to make this a little better? How can we move the needle to make things go a little further in the right direction here? And then, of course, the reporting is going to be people who are in the organization who need to know exactly down to the decimal level what has changed, and that allows them to look for anomalies and things like that. So it's always important to know what the roles are for these different types of displaying data and visualizing data, and where certain types of visualizations are appropriate and inappropriate. So now I guess we can move on here. But this is the if you want to know more information about more about where we got this kind of concept, you can go to and we'll be putting the link to our presentation, our slide deck up once we've wrapped up here. And you can go in through and click on any of the links you want. So we're going to be interspersing throughout here some quotes from you could say like celebrity data types of people. So here's a good one here from Edward Tufte. Clutter and confusion are not attributes of data; they are shortcomings of design. So that this is really kind of focuses on if your report is too cluttered, or sorry, if your BI solution is too cluttered, then when someone goes to look at it, they're going to go, this is too overwhelming. They're going to leave, or they might get the wrong idea. There's a lot of ways that that data can be miscommunicated and end up with people having the wrong idea about what they're supposed, or they're taking the wrong idea away from it. So, all right, well, let's continue.
Definitely.
So. And Ahmed, you were the one that told me about Schneiderman's visual information seeking mantra. Go ahead.
So initially when James introduced this concept to me, we were talking, he said, have you ever heard of the DAR principle? I'm like, oh, no, I haven't. That sounds new to me. So I did some digging and I did some reading up on the topic, and James, prepared some content, and I was like, that sounds a lot like something else I've read and I've stumbled across. And it's because it is essentially very similar. So you can kind of think of the DAR principle as an over sort of, it represents really information architecture. So when you maybe read up on this area about report design and or BI solution design, you might stumble across the term information architecture. It's essentially, how do we lay out information so that it's consumable for the various audiences that we have. And so it kind of rung a few bells, and I pulled in a couple of concepts that you may be familiar with in your reading or what you've stumbled across. One of them is the Schneiderman's visual information seeking mantra. So the mantra is overview first, zoom and filter, and then details on demand. And so very, very similar to how the DAR principle works, is essentially your dashboard, the D component of the DAR principle, is your overview, right? It's your thermometer. You're taking a quick glance, you're an executive, you're looking at the page, and you're just getting a quick read on the health of the organization. Pretty much that's what it ends. And it functions as sort of like a launching pad for the rest of the dashboard. You sort of, you're highlighting key indicators. This is the concepts that will be, that are presented, or the KPIs that we're interested in. Now you can jump off of that point if it requires further analysis. So if, I don't know, random, turnover happens to be particularly high, it might stimulate further analysis or further questions. And that's what the next pages are, the analysis pages. So that's where you can kind of do that exploratory analysis. You may apply a couple of slicers, you're kind of looking at different trends, you're getting a sense of the data, and essentially kind of follows a very similar line of this visual information seeking. So you overview first, you zoom and filter, that's your analysis page, and then details on demand. And the details on demand is where you get into those tabular reports, particularly for finance people, because finance people, no matter how many dashboards you give them, they're always going to come back and ask you for that tabular data. They're just, they've lived with Excel for far too long now for you to strip it away from them. And then in terms of how you can actually apply this to Power BI reports that you develop, you don't necessarily have to have the exact names or components, but it's similar how you design your BI tool. So you have your landing page where your high-level KPIs. You'll have, for each of those KPIs, the way I build my reports is for each of those KPIs, I'll have a dedicated page for each of those ones. And then I'll have these these detail on demand, or essentially drill through pages or tooltip pages that will contain further details should they require should they require that information. And I've kind of coined a term that I use, is like the hierarchy of granularity. So different depending on where you are in that organizational hierarchy, your demand for granular data sort of differs, right? So you can think of an executive at the top. They just don't have the time of day to be really getting into the nitty gritty stuff, right? They're really, really granular. They're going to be high level people. Whereas maybe someone on the ground, actual like a foot soldier or your operations manager who's really heavily involved in the day-to-day operations, every nuance and every sort of, piece is going to be relevant for them. So they're going to want that level of detail. So it's just kind of meeting the audiences where they're at and understanding their needs. Yeah, James, you have anything you want to add on this?
Yeah, I was just going to say before we move on here, I think that the word dashboard, when we talk about it in the context of BI solutions, is actually a really good metaphor, because think about when you're driving a car or flying a plane, your dashboard is
Yes.
really just your overview of all of the most important things you need to know about that vehicle, how fast it's going, what is your how much gas do you have left, things like that. And then it also has some like trouble indicators that will just be off unless there's a problem. And so normally when you're driving down the road, there's very little that you're actually going to see when you look down there. Is just the very, very like bare minimum that you need to know to keep the car or plane, whatever, going on the right direction and arriving safely. And it will only really just it will only alert you if there's a problem, with the like check engine light, or if your oil pressure is low, or your engine temperature is too high, that kind of stuff, right? Those are things that an executive, the person driving the vehicle, needs to know. But beyond that, it's not really interactive, right? Like you don't. It would be pretty disastrous if you were driving your car and you had to, like, in order to find out how fast you were going, you had to go in and you had to like drill through on your dashboard to figure out how, like, that would be nonsensical. We need basically something that's non-interactive so that you can look at it and go, within just a handful of seconds, you need to know exactly what you need to do next, because you're the one who is driving the vehicle. But if you've got people who are, like, for instance, to go down to the next level of this this metaphor, the zoom and filter level, or the analysis level, would be something like if you had one of those like custom things that plugs in under your under the dashboard, and it has a little second screen over here that starts telling you, like, here's your like your boost level if you have like a turbo in your car and things like that. Normally that stuff isn't visible on your actual dashboard, but it might be helpful for you if you really wanted to know a little more about the specific performance aspects of something going on in your car. And then beyond that, the same data that's used to generate those visualizations on like a little custom thing that plugs in under your dashboard, if you were to take it to the shop and you take it to a mechanic and they plug in their thing, they can actually get the tabular data, down to the very little, every single one of those. They can tell you down to the the hundredth of a millibar how much pressure is in each of your tires, and like which one of your spark plugs is misfiring, things like that, right? And so that is the kind of I really love the dashboard analogy or metaphor for that exact reason, because it allows us to apply this concept to something we're already very familiar with, and the amount of information that someone like us, if we're just driving the car, we don't want to know which spark plug is misfiring. We just want to know whether there's a problem with the engine, and we go pay a professional to figure out what to do from there, right? So.
Yeah, definitely. I think I'll kind of like tell a little anecdote here. One of my clients actually came up with a really neat idea for a dashboard. So this was, some years ago. They were working in a call center, and he figured that really people on the call takers don't really need to know all of these stats unless it's really important for them to do so. So he came up with this idea where he created a report, a dashboard, if you will, and he had the font and the elements on the page the exact color of the wall that it was projected onto. So he was projecting this dashboard onto a wall, matched it by the hex code, had it right, like, so if essentially if there was nothing there to really highlight, it was completely invisible. And only when certain metrics, I don't know, call waiting time or something would pop up where it was a problematic, then you'd actually see color come up. And the whole idea behind it was, we don't need to distract people. If there's nothing that they really need to action, there's no reason to distract them with a bunch of colorful, doohickeys and things on the screen. So, take that, into consideration. And another maybe anecdote on this point, it's funny because during the COVID pandemic, I remember I was called in to do some work. I was seconded from my job working at one of the health authorities locally, and I was seconded out by one of the executives at the Ministry of Health. And the sort of problem that they were facing was that a bunch of these executives that were responsible for these big portfolios were particularly distracted by the reporting that they were seeing by some of the analysts there. And so they had stumbled across some of the work that I had shared publicly on LinkedIn, and they asked me to come in and help them sort of simplify and help them create a more executive friendly view. And essentially, I applied exactly these principles, right? So I created that landing page, and I created that, the different views, the analysis, the reporting pieces. And it was funny because I got into a pretty heated discussion actually with one of the lead analysts there at the Ministry of Health. Um, and I remember he said, I showed him my dashboard, and he said, well, that's too simple. I said, well, that's the point. He said, well, I can't, you are misleading the executives because you're not telling them the full picture. And then I said to him, I said, I would argue actually the opposite. I think you're misleading them because you're feeding them too much information. They're not paying attention. They're distracted and they're relying on their gut anyways. So at least at this one, they're at least getting some amount of data into their sort of decision-making process. So
Right.
strong advocate for these principles. I think it's, details on demand is a really, good way to go about it.
Yep.
I'll leave you with a quote.
Yeah, so this is one of my favorite authors on data visualization, Cole Nussbaumer. I'm hoping I'm saying it right, Naflick. Having all of the information in the world at our fingertips doesn't make it easier to communicate. It makes it harder. And this plays right back into what Ahmed was just talking about, how if an executive is looking at a dashboard that's too complicated, they're actually not going to absorb any of it, and they're going to fall back to what they used to do before they had the data, which is just, this is a term that I coined a while ago, gastroanalytics, where they're just using their gut, and that's it. And so I really don't want executives in the organization to fall back to gastroanalytics. I want them to rely on data to make the decisions. And so, and I think probably if you ask them, they would say that they do want to rely on data. They don't, and they may not even realize that they're doing it when they look at a dashboard and they go, that's too complicated, and they go back and rely on their gut. But I think people want to do the right thing, and they want to have their decisions in the organization be data driven. But if we don't present the data to them in a way that is conducive to that, it will make it less likely that they will end up that will end up being the outcome.
Totally. Yeah. So I'll be able to talk a little bit about this. So this idea again of the DAR principle, it kind of takes another flavor. You may have heard about it in other lenses too. So one of the other ways you might have heard about this principle is expansive hierarchical structure. So this is something I actually stumbled across in one of my readings. I'm actually forgetting the book right now. I'll probably find it later, but it's a UX book. I've been reading a lot about UI and UX recently, because I think that although they're not data specific types of reads, the practices in that domain are so full and they're so well studied that there's a lot of things that we can bring into our space in the data space. So this concept was introduced in one of the books I was reading. I believe it was Laws of UX. It's a really good book by John Jablowski. Really, really good read if you want to pick it up. And he talks about this, about designing systems, designing solutions that are expansive hierarchical structures. So that means that, as you progress through a solution, you're getting more and more detail. So think of, like a patient, you're at a doctor's office, you're asked to fill in some form. Those large forms that have lots of information, often you kind of just glance over it and you just put in information, sort of not really thinking, right, about the information you're putting in. Whereas if you design systems and solutions that sort of take bits and pieces of the information you need, as well as lay it out in a way that's more consumable, it's a much more friendly experience for the user. So your UX, your user experience really gets a hike and gets increased for your users. So, kind of think about that as you're designing your BI solutions.
100% agree. Yeah, just because we're not our job title doesn't include anything about UI UX doesn't mean that we're not actually doing UI UX design, which I mean we really are. If we're designing the thing that the user interacts with, whether they're just looking at it or they're clicking through it and they're drilling through, all of that is user interface. And
Yeah.
so this is one of the ways in which BI sort of lies at a really cool intersection between different disciplines in the tech world, where oftentimes data people are really just data engineers or they're database
Yeah.
administrators, and oftentimes UI UX people are really doing just only the front end design, and they have very little to do with the back end databases or the back end systems that make the front end work. As BI engineers, we actually get to do some of both, which I think is really fun.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. I think there's a, sort of a rise of a new sort of skill set. And I've actually seen quite a few roles pop up now on my LinkedIn feed where they're hiring a lot of people who have like that intersection of Power BI strengths with like a UI and UX background, because they know that designing reports just for the sake of designing reports is not really going to land with their audiences, right? So they need people who have that ability to not just make them pretty, but usable is really the piece there. User friendly. Um, this is a great quote by Hans Hoffman. Hans Hoffman is actually nothing to do with data. He's an abstract artist, and he says this really a lovely quote. He says, "The ability to simplify means to eliminate the unnecessary so that the necessary can speak." So, oftentimes I find like when I'm, with students that I'm teaching or with peers that I'm working with, they'll often kind of see this blank canvas and they'll think, okay, well, I've got the blank canvas. How much can I fit in this real estate? And so they just throw as many charts as they can in that space, really with no intention, like intentional design or thought that goes into it. And in fact, the other way to look at this is just peel back the layers that are really not necessary, that are maybe good to know, but not necessarily necessary to know, right? So it's kind of peeling back some of those elements so that you really set the stage for the really crucial pieces to come to light. Any any introductions, thoughts?
I love that anytime that we can take some wisdom from a completely unrelated discipline. We're talking abstract art here. I mean, the only thing it might have in common maybe a little bit is the visual elements where we are
For
doing
sure.
data visualization. But I mean, I think there's a lot of value to be had in thinking outside the box in that sense of when if we do nothing but just read SQL and DAX and Power Query books all day long, we're in a way, we'll get a lot of expertise in those technical subjects, but if we don't ever read any philosophy or anything like that, we might kind of paint ourselves into a bit of a technical corner, and so I think it pays to keep our minds open to the idea that there's some wisdom to be gained completely outside of our discipline, and ways that we can apply that wisdom to our day-to-day work practice.
Yeah, ditto. I love that. Love that.
All right.
Yeah,
Another after Edward Tufte quote here. Excellence in statistical graphics consists of complex ideas communicated with clarity, precision, and efficiency. Couldn't say it better
totally.
myself.
Yeah, definitely. Edward Tufte is the guy. I mean, like, yeah, Edward Tufte, just to give people, maybe if anyone's not familiar with this name, but if you're remotely, interested in data visualization, his name comes up. Edward Tufte is a bit of a sage, a modern day sage for data visualization. He emerged in the 1980s and really took a lot of the best practices that were being spoken about in different domains around graphic design and graphic interface design, and he culminated them in a book that he wrote. I'm blanking on the name right now. I've got it on my bookshelf behind me. But anyways, he took those best practices and put them into sort of like checklists in this book that he wrote. So when you're creating a bar chart, you're creating a line chart, when you're creating spark lines, here's the sort of step-by-step formatting rules you should follow. Now, because his approach is very rigid and structured, he's kind of a little bit taboo these days among the data visualization community, because they kind of think that his stuff is really, really blanket rules. But the way I personally like to look at Edward Tufte's guidance is not necessarily, he's not right all the time, but he kind of gives you a good rule of thumb when you're starting to get better in wanting to look for some structure in your data visualization. Because many of us are coders and developers. We love objective truth, right? We love things that are just clear cut. You do it this way, it works. Any other way, there's just no room. But really, data visualization is one of those subjective sciences. So it does depend on the context. It depends on the audience. There's so much there beyond just, applying rules and rigid sort of structures. So Yeah, really, really interesting. I think there's actually another book too. If anyone's interested in the history of data visualization, there's a book I think it's called The History of Data Visualization. It's a really great book.
Hmm.
Kind of walks you through the sort of the birth of data visualization and communicating using pictures back in the 1800s. Really, it was when it gained a lot of traction, and how we
Hmm.
got to where we're at today with all these interactive BI solutions.
Yep. Yeah, the very first data visualizations were before the advent of any sort of computer. Not even well, okay, I guess it depends on if you count the abacus as a computer, but
Yeah,
yeah, there were people visualizing data in ways that will look, if you looked at the way that they did, I mean, it was just pen paper, but if you looked at it, you go,
yeah,
wow, that looks surprisingly modern,
yeah,
and it's really interesting to see some of those early examples of data
yeah.
visualization.
Yeah, Florence
Yep.
Nightingale kind of gained a lot of traction for that, right? So if you actually
Hmm.
read the tale in that book, we were actually talking about this book the other day, James and I, Effective Data Storytelling by Brent Dykes. It's a really great
Hmm.
book at kind of walking you through some of that history and key events and data visualization. But Florence Nightingale, being the person that she was, in the trenches, helping soldiers and relaying that information to people who are just really disinterested, right? There was just not a lot of appetite for hearing these gruesome facts that were happening in faraway lands in Crimea at the time. She figured that the best way to bring and advocate for the data was to give it life through images, and so she commissioned someone to actually create these colorful drawings and help to bring life to the data. So really great stuff. Yeah, and should we actually drop the name of the book in the chat, or drop the title of the book in there? So that's the
Hmm.
one. It's the visual display of quantitative information. So it's a bit outdated, you'll see. It's very, very outdated at this point. But a lot of the
Right.
practices there are sort of the foundations for a lot of these, thou shalt do this and thou shalt not do that when it comes to formatting. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, David got it. Yeah. The other, maybe another concept here that you may have heard again if you're kind of in this, reading up on this, but there's this concept of progressive disclosure. Progressive disclosure essentially means as you progress through something, it's disclosing more information. Again, details on demand. As you're moving through an interface, more details are revealed to you where it makes sense for you, right? So it's a
Hmm.
technique in UX design that reduces the cognitive load. And that's a really key important piece because, you can think of I don't know. I've built lots of reports for executives, so those are the people I kind of like I've worked with most. But they're busy people. They've got crazy work hours, crazy responsibilities, and you're the analyst that's helping them to get data so that they can actually make more informed decisions, and they really just don't have a lot of time to decipher and try to decode the reports that they're given. So you have to kind of be that person who's going to help them sort of understand and almost spur a little bit of curiosity. This is the kind of thing that I think people, like, again, they don't necessarily think about when they're designing reports or BI solutions. They don't necessarily think about the psychological elements. There's kind of like a story I tell a lot of my students. I say, have you ever been on a date where the person's sitting there on your first date and they kind of give you their whole life story? Chances are they're not going to get a second date, right?
Hmm.
Because they've kind of overwhelmed you. There's nothing really left for you to, be curious about and understand. And
Right.
so kind of
Might even
enticing
be
people a little
TMI,
bit.
right?
Yeah, yeah, too much. Totally.
Right.
So
Yeah, and that can be a turnoff. Just on
totally.
a date is exactly the same way in the boardroom. If
In
you
the
give them too much
boardroom,
information, it's going to
too
shut
much
them off, and they're
information.
going to say, you know what, I don't need any of that.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think kind of relying a little bit on that psychological element of curiosity and enticing people to kind of ask rather than you telling them information is a much more productive relationship to get in with your stakeholders and such. Yeah. Yeah.
100% agree.
Here's another lovely quote
Yeah,
by Hans Rosling.
another epic Hans. We're
Yeah.
putting our Hans together here.
Yeah. So he says the world cannot be understood without numbers, and it cannot be understood with numbers alone. Hans Rosling is the guy who did the famous TED talk where he had the sort of answering the question: Is population going to grow? Are we going to grow faster than resources are available? And he had a really awesome chart where he showed that. He's since his work is actually still popular on the internet. So if you do want to watch his stuff, phenomenal data storyteller, someone who really understood understood that, a graph is not sufficient to communicate data. You really got to give it life by narratives. So really, really cool stuff. I think BBC actually picked him up for like a docuseries as well. So those are available on YouTube, I think, if anyone's really, want to get nerdy and watch some data content. Yes. Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we have the next section here. We're going to show something it's about basically the position on the page of the solution. So we're going to show how important it is to put the right things in the right places on the page, because with modern eye tracking software, and hardware, of course, you need the camera to do it. We can actually detect where someone is looking on the page with their eyeballs, and then based on what they look at first and what they spend the most amount of time looking at, we can kind of see, all right, what do they feel is the most important part of this page? And what you'll notice when we look at these heat maps is, because they're a heat map over time, you'll notice that the very first thing that they look at is the upper left corner of the page. Now, that may be a bit of a Western-centric kind of thing. So,
Yeah.
If you were designing for an audience that has a written language that goes right to left, Arabic, Hebrew, I think a few other languages. So it might be a good idea to do some if you have some clients who are in that kind of demographic, you might want to find out whether that same principle would apply in reverse there. But in general, most of us, probably our clientele or the organizations we work in are sort of Western for the most part. And so we can look in at the upper left corner of the page as being the kind of the hot zone for if there's something you really want them to see. And if they only look at the page for 5 seconds and they bounce, what's the most important? What is the thing you want them to know more than anything else? Put it there. So let's go through here. And before we actually look at the animations, as you're watching them, also see if you can try to identify any other patterns in the eye tracking data besides what we're talking about in terms of the position on the page and anything like that, and see if you can try to spot any other patterns, and then try to come up with some hypotheses of your own as to why someone might look at other parts of the page. They start in the upper left, but they might go zip all the way down to the bottom right or some other place. See if you can spot some things about the things that they're looking at that might be oh, well, they looked at that because of this or that. So fire away there, Ahmed. Let's see this.
Do it. Right, so the regions that are popping up in white right now that are visible is essentially where they saw a lot of eyeballs sort of looking, and as you can see, a large portion of the page here is still remaining black even after some time, right? So there's areas on the report page when we kind of thought about like how to organize your BI solution from the report structure or the page structure. Now we're kind of looking on within the page itself where to position certain visuals so that they're more visible, or they gain more attraction in people's attention. You can kind of see that there's something happening here, right? You see that the top area generally gets a lot of attention. That top center area gets the most eyeballs, the most attention. So if you can kind of think strategically about those key visuals, those key insights, and position them there, that's a really, really good thing. The other thing too that James pointed out to me when we were looking at this is he said, notice the bottom right corner. There's a really colorful chart there in the bottom right corner. Potentially the color is actually another way we can actually send a message without necessarily having to say it specifically and say, hey, look here, this is something important for us to see. We don't have the unfiltered page in the slide deck, unfortunately. Sorry about that. Okay, yes. Cool.
Yep. So yeah, one thing I wanted to point out is that you can actually see here, if people who are attending here are familiar with some of the terminology from Power BI specifically, you can look across the top of the page here, and you can see that there are some card visuals that are being utilized there, and that is a very, I think, a very potent way of displaying key things that you want people to take away, key takeaways. And of course, you can also see a little bit, you can see places where there's like some indicators, maybe some color information and you got to see those little red dots. I'm sure that probably has a meaning in this context for the users, where if they take 5 seconds looking at across the top of this page, they can probably get most of what they need to know just from that. And then the lower on the page is kind of more the analytical kind of thing. So you could actually think of this as being sort of a hybrid, where it's got a bit of the dashboard kind of aesthetic at the top, and then it's got more of the analytical stage in the bottom part of the page. normally you would not want to try to put all of those on the same page, but you can see that it really does draw the dashboard kind of stuff tends to draw the most attention.
Yeah.
And then so that's it's good to try to, I think this is I think is emphasizing the or it's kind of showing us that it's the simpler your data visualization, the more likely it is to draw people's eyes and digest that information. So
for sure. Yeah, absolutely. Here's another one too. This is another eye tracking. You can see they kind of use the heat map style here. So the regions that are kind of appearing darker are getting a lot more attention. Yeah, so yeah, once again, just kind of iterating that, the key pieces here are, those key KPIs, those KPIs right at the top of the screen there. As you sort of move down the page, you're getting less and less attention from your users, generally speaking. And so, thinking about where you position, again, your visuals are really, really key to making sure that your message is actually, resonating. Anything else you want to add, James?
Not on this page. This. I mean, if anybody had any observations or hypotheses about some other patterns they might have observed in that, and maybe some ideas about maybe why some of those patterns could be, some explanations for why we would observe those patterns, we'd love to hear about it in the chat there.
Totally.
We got another quote here from Cole Nussbaumer Knaflick. You should always want your audience to know or do something. If you can't concisely articulate that, you should revisit whether you need to communicate in the first place.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's basic. The whole idea of data-driven decision making. If there's no decision to be made, what's the point? It should be, let's try to find a way to make solutions that are actually going to help the business move the needle in the right direction. So if we're trying to increase profits, if we're trying to reduce costs, if we're trying to maybe do something like improve our reputation, those are all things that can be measured to varying degrees. Obviously, reputation may be a little bit less quantitative than something like sales, but these are things that can be measured, and the point isn't to measure them. The point is to help figure out what can we do as a business when we know what the results of those measurements are to try to improve those measurements.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love this quote here. This is again from the business area, business communications. So how well we communicate is determined not by how well we say things, but how well we are understood, right? So just talking for the sake of talking or presenting information for the sake of information doesn't do anything for your audiences unless you're articulating, and you're helping them understand the information. And using some of the strategies that we talked today, those are ways that you can actually help them understand these concepts. Yeah.
Yep.
Cool. So I think the next piece that we wanted to get into, the last segment before we go into our direct query, is the screw up, right? So this is where things go wrong. This is where people don't follow these practices, and this is what happens. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples actually, just to show you. And just a heads up, all the data that's going to be shown here is all fake data. This is just for presentation purposes. So if anyone, you might see some official looking logos, it's just all fake data. So, this is where the problem starts, right? Power BI gives you a lot of freedom, right? Gives you that white canvas. And for a lot of people, what they see is they just see, I've just got to fill up as much of the white space as I possibly can. And again, that's how we have these things. We have the default setting disasters, right? So again, Power BI doesn't necessarily choose the nicest colors, and they don't give you a lot of structure out of the box. So you end up with things like this, right? You end up with slicers that don't make sense, visuals placed randomly on the page, things at different levels of granularity, just a complete mess, right? Taking that same data and applying some of the concepts we talked about today, and maybe we'll talk about some more in the future about enhancing sort of that UI, you end up with something that looks like this. A lot more digestible, right? The same data that was shown in the previous page, just organized and restructured in a way that's much more receptive. So we're thinking about where we're placing our slicers, placing them in one common location so they don't have to jump across the screen too much. Then we're placing those key indicators at the top of the screen and the more detailed stuff as we go down the page, right? So things like this, these small visual decisions can go a long way. And then that way we're not sort of turning our end users into Sherlock Holmes where we're asking them to go solve a puzzle. We're actually giving them the insights and helping them sort of, be more aware of the situation, giving that situational awareness. Yeah. Another one I want to show here. This is another example, right? you see these you see these a lot in reports, these tabular forms of data. There's nothing really here that sticks out for me. All I see is a bunch of indicators, and there's nothing really that's surfaced. So one of the things that we want to do when we're designing reports is that we actually want to make it more action oriented. So highlighting those things that we want people to pay attention to. So if I was to ask you right now, tell me the highest value in this column, it would be hard. You'd have to look through and spend some time. I can tell you this is the answer, but there's nothing there for me to indicate that this is the solution, right? The longest time for arrival for an ambulance, for example. But doing something like this, where sorting that column in a descending order, adding sort of indicators, visual cues, maybe something also jumps out of the page and says, this is not good, but actually we're on a downtrend. We're actually improving. So does it really need our attention? Small visual elements like this can go a very long way at helping people understand the information and not just giving them an export of the data, right? I think one of the things that I've learned over the years is if you hear someone, can you export that, say, export it to Excel, generally means that your report or your BI solution is not cutting it for them, right? It's not doing the job that needs to be there. That's why they're asking for the Excel sheet, because they don't want to admit that they're not, they don't understand what's being shown to them. So they want to take things into their own hands and try to figure it out on their own time, which is, not everyone has the sort of the patience to do that, right? So then you end up with those gastro analytics. I love that. Love that. Yeah. So in the last 15 minutes here or so, we've got it open for our direct query segment. This is open for questions, comments, thoughts. We've got a smaller group here today, so it's more intimate. So if you've got questions, you want to, get them off your chest, we're here. We're all ears. Yeah. And
feel free to come off mic. You don't have to put it in the chat too.
Yes,
This is a small enough group. I
definitely.
think that we could probably get away with that.
Yeah,
Or
definitely.
come off mute is what I mean.
I have a question, and you've already half answered it. And it was watching your slide on the eye patterns and where people were going.
Yeah.
A design thing we always think about is, like you said, where do you put the slicers? I've seen reports that have 12 or 15 slicers. It's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And do you put them across the top in a band, like in a header with a corporate logo, or do you put them off to the side? I'm just curious to see if the analysis includes, well, you got to have a few slicers somewhere typically. So does it make more sense to have them on the left if that's the prime real estate, or across the top in a fairly short header?
Right. It kind of depends on how important the slicer or the ability to slice is to the functionality of that particular page. So if the slicer is basically central to the user's ability to understand what they're getting out of it, you may want to put the slicer in a place they're more likely to see it up front. So maybe having it on the left side of the page is a good place for it to be if seeing it and is crucial to knowing that it's there, that they can use it. On the other hand, if you're going to have enough slicers to where they can basically do almost anything that they want, that would be way too many slicers to have on a page, and almost all the page would be taken up with slicers. And so I think that's a good argument for using a slicer panel where you can have like a bookmark driven thing where there's a button somewhere that says click here to open the slicer panel, and have it just give you a big old modal window that pops up in here. It covers most of the report, but gives you, here's all the slicers you could possibly need. And then, all right, I've got all the slicers I want, the button to dismiss the slicer panel and have it disappear into the background again. And now your data is filtered. You would probably want to include some way to indicate on the page that slicers have been applied. So maybe some sort of indicator that slicers are active on this page, and have that turn on or off. And a teammate and I recently developed a way to basically build an indicator to show that there are slicers that are active on that page, even if those slicers are in a hidden panel. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions on how to implement something like that. I'd be happy to provide a template for it.
Yeah, I kind of wish that area they had a better solution in Power BI, because I think it's common. So many of us we do shopping like online, and it's very familiar. You see at the very top of the screen when you applied a few slicers, it sort of indicates that these are the filters that are applied really obviously. So I think that can be something that can be improved or improved upon. The other thing too, that just to kind of pick up on Ian's question, it kind of depends too. Like, so the research in this area says that there are sort of two types of people in the world. There are your F pattern people and your Z pattern people. So there are some people that they kind of they read a screen and an F pattern. They go along the top and they scroll along the side and they kind of go a little bit into the middle of the page. There are some people who don't are not like that. They're Z pattern. They zoom across the top, they zigzag across the middle, and then they go along the bottom. So it's kind of like, you know, I mean, the common ground between them is the top portion. It gets attention whether you're an F pattern person or a Z pattern person. So maybe you could argue that it's probably better in that case to position your slicers at the top of the screen, but usually it's pretty cluttered because you've got your report title, you've got your last refresh information.
Right.
So you got to kind of consider the things and weigh it, I guess, as it comes, right? It's not the most, you know, clear answer, I guess.
I would say that putting the report title in the upper left corner is something you could certainly question that guidance.
Yeah,
You know,
sure.
a lot of documents in history have had their title in the upper left corner because that's kind of just, we normally have our typeset where things are started on the left side by default.
Yeah.
But who's to say what has to be there? It could be that you want to put the title on the right side of the top of the page, and then
True.
leave the left side of the top for your KPIs, or maybe for a really important filter that you want to, or a slicer that you want to give people access to. So question assumptions about where things belong. Especially if it's just something it's always been there traditionally. But if it's like the title of the report, well, people already probably know which report they're looking at because they clicked on it.
Yeah.
So does it even need a title?
Yeah.
That's a question that and you and your stakeholders can answer. And you know, if not having a title on the report frees up some canvas space that you could use for other things, that's something that's probably worth talking about.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I think so. David mentioned bookmarks. I so I don't like bookmarks. I don't think they're good. But actually, Miguel actually just put a PSA out for on LinkedIn, gathering some feedback on how to enhance the bookmark feature. So if you do have some strong opinions, go voice them there. If you've got the patience to do so. But I think the way that we think about bookmarks, it's just oftentimes it makes the report so difficult to maintain. And especially because, the really skilled developers, they often develop and move on to the next project. Someone else comes and takes over. It's one of those areas where it's just really fragile if you leave behind a, bookmark ridden report, in my opinion.
That is getting better, and it will be much easier to fix problems like that on a large scale. Like if you've inherited a report and you need to fix a bunch of bookmarks across all the pages, it'll be much easier to do that once PBIR format gets out of preview, and once it gets to the point where it's no longer going to have all these limitations. I'm resisting using PBIR right now because of how the limitations are basically preventing it from being used in production, really, in most cases. But when that becomes available, you'll be able to open up the PBIR format files in any code editor and do a find replace across all of them. So if you need to fix a bookmark across all of your pages, it'll be much easier to do it at that point. Just like we've been able to do find replace and mass updates on the tabular model with Tyndall editor, and with if we to do mass updates on the things like the DAX measures all in the DAX query view. So
I think alternatives. So I think there's actually a couple of things we could use. We could repurpose in Power BI. So field parameters are great because field parameters allow you to swap out different measures in your graph, right? So you could have one graph and just essentially swap the base measure inside of that chart. What I would like to see, ideally, the versatility you get with calculation groups, where you can have really dynamic tables. I love that. Especially if you're doing lots of time intelligence, I'd love the marriage of like field parameters and calculation groups. That to me is like as a solution of a bookmark. If you can kind of meet those two, the flexibility you get is amazing. There are some kind of solutions that are a little bit crazy, and so you can kind of do that today, but it's not easy. I think if they can kind of figure out a way to get those two features together, I don't think there'll be a need for having bookmarks in the future at all. Yeah, for sure. Let's see here.
Yep.
Any other questions, thoughts? I'm just going through the chat to see if there was anything that came in earlier.
Looking for question marks. I don't see anything with Q's at the beginning of them, so I'm looking for question marks, trying to figure out if we have questions.
I'm going to make a comment that may not be popular because I have a lot of people who don't like to use matrices. Avoid the matrix, right? Sort of coming back to slicers for a second. When there's a group of things that's, say, fairly large number of members, say like 15 or 20, let's say, right? Ahmad will appreciate this because in healthcare, which is the field I work in, you typically want to see things by a specific, what we call a provider, right? A physician or a care provider. that's a fairly long list depending on where they are. Like an emergency room provider is 20 or 25 at a particular hospital. So rather than put it in a drop-down slicer, takes up a lot of space, you can actually put the measures in a matrix with the providers or whatever the thing is, because that way it also functions as a way to show the data, but then when you configure that matrix to actually filter the rest of the page when you select a provider, effectively it's a slicer too. And I'm kind of a fan of that because it serves two purposes. It's a slicer, but it's also a way just to present the data initially.
Right.
And if it's a manageable number, it actually works very elegantly, and you can format it so it's pretty clean looking on the page.
Yep.
And
if you only ever need to select one at a time, that works just fine, right? But if you have the need to be able to select more than one category at a time, then that doesn't work. Yeah. But yeah, in a lot of cases, if you're looking at a specific location or something, most of the time you don't need to compare or to look at two locations combined. That would make a lot of sense. So, yep.
You build a report for the manager of, say, that emergency department, because they're going to analyze, well, who are underperforming providers based on number of patients or turnaround time or whatever it happens to be. So yeah, in that specific case, it works really well, I think.
Yeah, I agree. One of the things too, I think would really help. There was actually an idea someone proposed about having almost like how you have your data modeling view where you can see the relationships between tables. It would be nice to almost have like a page model in a sense. That's a really cool idea. Like, I think that would be really awesome. The other piece, I think, there's a snap to grid right now in Power BI that's not really great. I think if they sort of had like templates for different types of reports, let's call the dashboards type, the analytics type, the report type. If you were able to select sort of a template design and then snap to the grid, I think that could vastly improve the quality of, especially like business users who are just doing self-service BI. So, I think that improvements to be made. Power BI keeps on coming along, so hopefully we'll get them one day. Yeah.
One question.
Yes.
Maybe this is more philosophical in a way, but I guess it may have a lot of it depends in the answer. I think Power BI, in Fabric is a totally bigger story, but even in Power BI, in order to develop a project, you need different expertise by different people to get the project complete. When we talk about designing reports and the topic from today's session, how much of that skill do you think we should have to be considered a good Power BI developer? Because when we work in Power BI projects, there is good people with expertise on data ingestion, good people with Power Query skills, other people have great skills for data modeling, and all that play together to get a good result at the end, the outcome you're looking for. But how much we should have about knowing how to design a good report, even though that might be the expertise of one person of the team.
Yeah, maybe I've got a hot take here, Chewy. What I've seen a lot of these large analytics departments do is they think, well, we want better looking reports. Let's go hire a bunch of UX designers. Problem with that is that you can have really good UX designers that will design ideal sort of scenarios that they are very, very difficult to create today in Power BI. Right. So I think you really need, right? You need strong Power BI developers. You need to have everyone who has a baseline level, but then sort of if you've got a larger team and you can sort of divide up, responsibilities, then I would say then start putting people on areas of their strength. Some people are really good at modeling and data transformation. If you're doing a lot of that and the data engineering is not handling that for you, put some people there. Put some people on DAX. Put some people on the visualization. Everyone having like that foundational understanding of Power BI is a given, but then you kind of develop little areas of specialization that you sort of gravitate towards. For me, it's always been like UI and UX. That's my area. So I drive towards that area more. I'm probably more interested in it than the average Power BI person, but that's my area. I don't know, like, depending, James, I don't know what it is for you. Do you find like a particular area you gravitate towards more?
My organization is small enough that I ended up kind of being a jack of all trades most of the time. So
that's the big, it depends, right? Like
for sure.
It depends on your team size or the expertise available in the team at the moment.
Definitely.
How soon they want the things done.
Yeah.
A lot of caveats.
Of course.
I'm an advocate of subject matter expertise, and really think about everything starts with the data model and pushing, like the max, and do as much work upstream as you can, closer to the data source. In other words, if I could do some good SQL coding on a SQL-based system to get to shape data the way I need it in my model before I even get it into Power Query, you can gain a lot of efficiencies that way.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. Awesome. Well, I think that brings us to the close of the session today. Our next segment will be in 2 weeks' time, so we'll have that up soon on LinkedIn. If anyone's curious, we will be publishing all this slide deck as well as the content on our GitHub. So we'll make sure to check it out there.
Let's pop the link for that in our chat here.
Yeah, and also just a quick request from everyone. We've got a LinkedIn page now, a company page. If you can go follow that page, because it'll open up a few features that we're keen to use in our streams. So if you don't have access to it, I'll link to it now. But if you could go and give us a follow, it would be greatly appreciated on the company page.
I just pasted it in there.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks so much.
Yep.
You beat me to it. That's awesome.
So yeah, if you want to try to get our slide deck, we also have we're putting our recordings up there. So if you go to the GitHub link that I put in there, and you look at the releases on the right side of the page, then you'll be able to get access to any of our previous slide decks and videos there.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks everyone. Really appreciate your time.
All right.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
We'll chat soon.
It was a lot of fun.
Take care.
See you all later.
Bye.
Take care.